We are excited to welcome our first speaker today, Dr. Dana Winters. As the Director of Simple Interactions and Academic Programs for the Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning and Children's Media, Dana Winters seeks to apply and advance the legacy of Fred Rogers in serving children and their helpers. Through projects involving children's helpers across many diverse settings, including childcare, school systems, community programs, residential care, and children's hospitals, she communicates and reflects what are essential truths in working in service of children and their families. Dana supervises the center's research lab, Incubator 143, which partners with educators, trainers, advocates, and researchers to focus on identifying and amplifying the power of human connection. She joined the center after serving as the senior evaluator for the Collaborative for Evaluation and Assessment capacity at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education, and as an education counselor with the Educational Opportunity Centers of Penn State University. Dana holds a PhD in Administrative and Policy Studies from the University of Pittsburgh, an MA in Education from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and a BA in Sociology from St. Vincent College. Dr. Winters' speech will center on presenting the extraordinary power of ordinary interactions. Serving children and families requires us to understand and address a complex system of challenges and opportunities. Yet there still is something deep and simple that connects all of us, the power of human connection. Resilience in our children begins with one person, someone to care, nurture, and provide shelter from life's difficult moments. At the foundation of every child's healthy development is the power of human connection, and we will explore the power we all have to build connections and contribute to the positive development of the children and youth around us. Please help me welcome Dr. Dana Winters to the La Crosse Rebuilding for Learning Conference.
Thank you very much. It's a little unnerving with the virtual component to watch everybody clapping and not hear anything, but I'm getting more and more used to it. I think I'd rather be, fighting airports and be with you in person today, but, we'll take what we can get. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I wish that I could be with you in Wisconsin. It's a state that I have never been to, which is a bit remarkable. I've been to 37, so you are on my list to get to soon as all of the uncertainty around us hopefully dissipates a bit. So we're going to test the fate of technology right now and see what we can do about sharing a screen. Here we go. All right, looks like that was a success so far. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's bright and early for you, and I appreciate you being here today. It's a little later for me, so it's after 9 o'clock, so I got a little more sleep and an extra cup of coffee in me already. But I'm very excited to be with you this morning. As the introduction said, I'm from the Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning in Children's Media, which is located in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh. So we're about an hour east of Pittsburgh. And the reason that we are located in Latrobe is because it is Fred's hometown. So Fred Rogers is that Mr. Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. If you either grew up watching The Neighborhood or possibly watched it with your children or grandchildren, it is that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I have the privilege of working in the original Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, not too far from where Fred grew up. So the Fred Rogers Center was envisioned by Fred himself when he was finishing his television career in the late 90s and early 2000s. He wanted to continue to serve children and families and children's helpers. And he thought, what better way to do that than to have a center located on a college campus where he could teach and continue to write, and he could engage with the next generation of children's helpers. Unfortunately, he did pass away before the center officially launched, but we are located on a very small Catholic college campus, which might seem a little weird for an ordained Presbyterian minister, but he was very dear friends with the Archabbot at St. Vincent. So when he entrusted his legacy, he entrusted it with friends in his hometown. And one of the most wonderful things about the Fred Rogers Center is that we have and we hold the archive of Fred Rogers, which to date is about 22,000 cataloged items from Fred's life. Everything from the scripts from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to all of the music compositions, his letters, his speeches, a lot of sweaters and sneakers. And it seems like every time David Knoll, who played Mr. McFeely, cleans out his basement, we get another delivery of a few more boxes. So our archivist has a great deal of job security. We just keep finding more and more. But a part of that archive are all of the original speeches that he wrote, all of the original interviews that he did with media. And so it gives us an opportunity to dig a little deeper into the man outside of the sweater and to understand him in the legacy of child development and human development and working in service of children and families and helpers for generations. Our work now at the center, we don't work directly with children, but we do serve what we call children's helpers. And of course, that term comes directly from Fred himself. Actually, it comes from his mom. So I'm sure that if you're familiar at all with Fred Rogers, you're probably familiar with the "look for the helpers" quote. It seems to be one that we've heard a lot in the last 8 months, especially, but we hear it a lot in times of uncertainty and adversity in our country. Every now and then you hear that "look for the helpers" quote come out as a beacon for children and families, what they can do when times are difficult. Now, that quote came from Fred's mom. When Fred was a young boy and he asked his mom, "What do I do when I'm afraid? What do I do if I'm scared?" And she told him to always look for the helpers. You'll always find someone helping. Now, I teach a course at the college called "What Would Fred Rogers Do?" And every semester I require my students to identify their favorite Fred Rogers quote and then work with our archivist to find the primary source and see if we're using it the right way, if there's more to it. One year, one of my students found that a Fred Rogers quote wasn't actually a Fred Rogers quote, that it had been attributed to him through the years, but was originally a quote from his mentor, Dr. William Orr. Now, I couldn't ask my students to do this without doing it myself. And so I took the "look for the helpers" quote and dug a little deeper because I wasn't satisfied that Fred's mom would just say, "Look for the helpers. You'll always find people helping." There had to be a little more to it. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that there was a little more to it. And the interview where Fred originally told everyone to look for the helpers, he went on to tell the story of why his mother told him to look for the helpers. And he says that his mother told him to look for the helpers because when you look for the helpers, you'll know that there is hope. Now, we've heard this quote a lot. We've seen it surface countless times in media. I have a Google alert for every time Fred Rogers is mentioned in the media, and I would say about 75% of those mentions are for this quote, people using it in articles or in interviews. But I've never seen the continuation of it. And I think the continuation of it helps us to think about our role as helpers and the hope that we provide to so many neighborhoods and communities and children and families across them, that our presence and the work that we do is more than just helping, but it provides that sense of hope. And that's something that as we emerge into an academic year that is pretty much unlike anything we've ever experienced before, and as we emerge into our communities being a part of uncertainty and adversity to the likes of which we haven't seen before, we as helpers can provide that hope. Now, this morning, I'd like to share with you 3 lessons I've learned from helpers across the work that I've been doing over the last almost decade now. So the work that I do is in affirming and noticing and amplifying and growing human relationships among adults and children and among adults in child-serving settings. That Fred Rogers told us that it's through relationships that we learn best and grow best. And that's true for children, but it's also true for us as grown-ups, that we learn best and grow best through relationships also. So this work has taken me around the country and around the world, working in early childcare and education, both in the United States and in China, in orphanage settings, in public schools and private schools, and preschools in rural China, across specialized schools for children with special needs, and in children's hospitals around the world, and to some mighty unlikely places where we find human relationships at the core of how we serve, how we help, and how we provide hope. Now, these are 3 lessons that I knew before we were faced with a global pandemic. However, they seem to ring especially true the longer we are a part of the current circumstances. And I hope that by sharing these lessons with you, that it gives us a little bit of a guide on how we continue to move forward in knowing that while the outsides of our world have been changing drastically and faster than we can keep up, the insides of what we need as helpers, of what families need and what children's needs, that the insides remain the same. And the insides of what we bring to this work just need to be translated a little bit to the current circumstances, but that the insides of how we serve can still serve the insides of the needs of children and families. So the first lesson I'd like to share with you this morning is that having at least one matters. Now, what does that mean to have at least one? I mentioned that I've been to some unlikely places to recognize and to affirm human relationships. And one of the more unlikely places where I've done this work is on the street corners of Pittsburgh. So you'll notice in this picture, the crossing guard in the middle of a very busy intersection in the city of Pittsburgh. And we worked with the crossing guards to show them the power of the interactions and relationships that they build with children. And one of the reasons this was a bit unlikely is because in Pittsburgh, all of the crossing guards report to the Department of Public Safety. They don't report to any school systems, which means they don't have daily interactions with anybody who traditionally serves children. So their training to be a crossing guard is they're given their reflective gear and their white gloves and their stop sign, and they are taught how to effectively stop traffic and keep children and families safe. And that's it. They aren't given any other kind of training of how to talk to children, how to be around families, how to be a person that can be trusted. That training doesn't come. However, when I spent some time with the crossing guards and filmed crossing guards across the city of Pittsburgh, it was very evident that they do far more than just keep children and families physically safe in traffic. So I'd like to share with you this morning, and I actually need to end real quick and reshare because I don't think I turned on the sound for my computer here. Let me do this very quickly here. We'll do share computer sound. All right, because while I saw your round of applause and I appreciated it but couldn't hear it, you watching Miss Paula and not being able to hear her would absolutely not work. So this is Miss Paula. Miss Paula is a Pittsburgh crossing guard, and she has been working on the same intersection for, oh my goodness, now about 15 years. And I just want to share with you a little bit of her morning as we think about what it means to be at least one and why having at least one matters.
Good morning. I like you here. Go ahead. Where's your jacket at?
I'm not cold.
You ain't cold? Okay. Where's your, I know, see, you got a jacket, huh? He said, I am. Good morning. She's grown up to be so beautiful. Look at her. Wow. I know. Wow. She looks just like you. That's your twin right there. Oh my. Good morning. Y'all go to the high school?
Yes.
All right. Have a blessed day.
Thank you.
You're welcome, baby. And your lips is shivering.
All we care is like beautiful.
That's me too. That's the worst time when my face is cold. Yeah, it feel like, oh mama, shh. I wish I could just warm you up. But if it's just like my hairs are good. Okay.
My face is cold.
Well, hurry up in then. It's time to go in, okay? Good morning.
Right.
Good morning. So, when are you going to know about the election? When you going to know if you won or not?
Okay.
Oh, huh. I got my fingers crossed for you. Even though I didn't get a cupcake, but I got my fingers crossed. Good morning, guys. Oh, your nails. Let me see your nails. All right, now. Let me see y'all of yours. All right, now. Go now. It's your bad self. You cold?
Fall baby.
You a fall baby?
Yeah, my birthday's November.
See, I hold traffic for you. Good morning, baby girl. I like your little bun. Your mom did your hair? Tell her I give her 100%.
So a little glimpse into Miss Paula's morning, where I think it's pretty evident that she does a lot more than just safely cross children from one corner of the street to the other. She takes an opportunity to say good morning to every single child that crosses that street, to every single adult that crosses that street. But she also makes it a point to remember and notice and make sure that every one of those children know that they are seen and heard in the morning before they enter the school building. She even notices that the nail polish color has changed on the nails of a few of the girls walking across the street. She remembers the election. She sends a message home to mom that the hair looks good, give her 100%. And through all of these very short moments, 5-10 seconds maybe, she's building relationships with every one of these children. And I think the difference that she makes, it's possible that it's most deeply felt in her absence, because I was standing there, and of course children have to come over and ask me what on earth I'm doing with a video camera on a street corner. And I asked one young man, I said, I want to see what Miss Paula does. I want to see, I'm just here to film her and watch what she does. What do you think of Miss Paula? And he looked at me and said, she wasn't here last week and I didn't know what to do. And I said, well, you couldn't cross the street with the other crossing guard there? He said, no, she wasn't here to say good morning, and my whole day felt weird. That she's become such a fixture right here in this crosswalk because she cares and because she's reaching out and saying, I can be trusted. You can be comfortable with me. I'll be here. I'm a consistent person in your life, even if it's 5 or 10 seconds in the morning or 5 or 10 seconds in the afternoon. And that's what it means to be at least one. And now the term at least one comes to us from research literature. And it was research literature across what it means to build resilience in children and in families. And the Harvard Center on the Developing Child a few years back pulled together all of the research about resilience, decades of research, to find what really matters. And what they found across all of that research was the one thing that really mattered was the presence of at least one stable and committed relationship. So for children to have a relationship with an adult. Now, what was striking from this is that it just takes one relationship to make a huge difference in the resilience in our children, but also that relationship did not have to be the same relationship when a child was Two, as that relationship grows to that child is 15, that it can be the presence of someone that child could count on, someone that child knew was stable and committed to their well-being, someone like Miss Paula, who can serve as that at least one when children need it. Now, Fred Rogers talked about resilience in much more beautiful language. He called it that knowing when someone cares about us, that when the gusty winds blow and shake our lives, we may bend with the wind, but we won't break. And that's what we see here. And when I had the chance to talk with the crossing guards, they told me unbelievable stories about how they were at least one in a child's life, because they just happened to be there, to be committed and consistent every single morning, to say good morning, to ask about the children's well-being, that they noticed when the child was missing for a few days on the way to school and would inquire and then be able to help in ways that I found pretty incredible and in ways that I hadn't even imagined. But they could be that at least one. And they face a number of challenges. And it's not like they have the greatest amount of resources. They've got their stop sign and themselves. That's it. It's not like they have the greatest amount of training to do this. This was the first time that their work outside of pedestrian safety had been acknowledged. But they still took it upon themselves to build that community of care because they knew how important it was for every child to have at least one supportive and committed person in their lives. And we think that that might be even more important right now, as the gusty winds are surely blowing and shaking our lives, is that we as helpers provide hope to children and families by stepping up to be that at least one. Because it's just not children who need that support. It's our families too. And it's one another as helpers. That at least one matters to children, but it matters to all of us, especially in the midst of gusty winds blowing and shaking our lives. So that's the first lesson I'd like to share with you this morning, that having at least one, it really matters. Now, the second lesson I'd like to share is we talked about relationships and how Miss Paula is building those relationships and how important relationships are. And relationships are, when you think of how you build a relationship, it can seem a little big. And so the work that we do in highlighting the importance of these relationships, something we've found across all of the child-serving settings where we've worked, is that the power of human relationships comes from very simple, everyday, ordinary interactions. That it's those moments like what you just saw with Miss Paula that get strung together to build these human relationships and become the power of what we see. That it's these ordinary moments that are the most important thing that we can give to our children and families to show that we care and to show that we'll be a stable and committed person in their lives. Now, I'd like to take you very far away from where all of us are right now to where our work began, to highlight the importance of these simple, ordinary interactions. Now, our work started from work that we were doing in orphanages overseas, where we were trying to highlight and to help to raise quality in orphanage settings. And one thing that while we were there that we saw that was kind of remarkable, that we didn't have a language to really even think about, and our checklists definitely weren't sophisticated enough to talk about it, was the power of the moments between caregivers and children in these settings. Now, this particular setting here is slightly different. This is a rural farming village outside of Qingdao, China, which is in the northern part of China. And this village, when the orphanages in the city of Qingdao were overflowing with children, this village said, we would love to foster children in our homes, that we will take hundreds of children into our homes, foster them, they can live with us and grow with us, and then during the day, they can go to that thing that you keep calling an orphanage, and that will be their school. And we farmers are now going to be teachers, and we're going to bring them together to learn and grow and think and be a part of a school environment. So what you see here is one of the preschool classrooms in we call it the foster village. And the woman in this picture used to be a farmer and is now a teacher in this foster village. And you'll notice that almost all of the children who come to this village have some type of disability, whether that be a physical disability, cognitive delays, that every child who's a part of this environment have come to the rural village because of their disability. So when you look at this moment that we were able to capture our first time there, when we came to try to help them with their quality, you can see they didn't really need us to help with quality. But this began the foundation of the work that we do, because there is so much good happening in places that are very unlikely, in the simplest of moments. So just 30 seconds, I'd like for you to experience what we experience every time we return to the foster village. So that's a pretty simple moment. But just because it's simple doesn't mean that it isn't deeply felt by the children and the caregiver, just like all of the moments we saw with Miss Paula. They're simple, but they're very deeply felt. Now we can also look at this moment and countless moments like it and break it down into parts that make this moment one of the foundational building blocks of a relationship between the children, among the children, and also between the children and the adult within the interaction. Because when I look at these, just these 30 seconds, and I bet if we had the ability to unmute and think about it, we would see countless things within this 30 seconds. There's so much here to see and think and to talk about. But overall, one of the things that just jumps right off of the screen is a sense of connection. That all of the children are connected with one another, and that they're connected with their caregiver through shared emotion and affect and engagement in what they're doing, that they didn't even notice that we were sitting there with a video camera, except at the end when they wanted to invite us to play with them because they were having so much fun, that they are deeply connected in what they're doing. And you can tell that this isn't just a chance happening, that they've done the hard work of building trust to come together and be connected in this way. Something else we see here is reciprocity. And what we mean by reciprocity is that when we look at this interaction, there's a balancing of roles. That nobody is necessarily in control, that they're passing along control, that they're sharing the power within the interaction, that there's what we would call a serve and return, that everybody has a chance to go back and forth, even if they're not speaking to one another. Their engagement with a broken pen and a piece of tissue paper shows that level of reciprocity, that they are sharing very much in this moment together. We see inclusion at the core of what it means to have inclusion. So inclusion is one of those terms that carries with it a lot of understanding of various parts of our world today. But when we think of inclusion at its core, it means the act of including and providing a sense of belonging. And when we look across 3 children here who have very, very different needs, all of them are included and invited to be a part of this moment. The child that she is physically holding, she becomes that inclusive device for her to be a part of this interaction. That child is 6 years old, but she functions at about a 6-month level, and she's not able to sit up on her own. In clinical and other institutions, we would not see these children together because they have very different needs. However, I don't know that anybody can make the argument that one person doesn't belong in the last 30 seconds that we just saw, that they're working to include one another as children, and that the adult is fostering that inclusion as well. And then across just 30 seconds, we see countless opportunities to grow. From the child sitting up, that's a physical growth, but also the sharing, the balancing of the roles. The list goes on. And when we think of opportunity to grow, we're not just thinking about skills and tasks and progression on cognitive skills or growth. We're looking at growth in social emotional ways. We're looking at growth in physical ways, in cognitive ways. There's so much to be grown in every single moment. And in just 30 seconds, we see the adult creating support and challenges and opportunities for that growth. Now, these 4 things right here have become the core of our work in highlighting their importance and showing that even the simplest of moments have the power to help us to learn and to grow, to help us to develop as children and as human beings, as grown-ups too. And it's because even in the simplest of moments, our helpers especially are doing the hard work of building relationships and doing the hard work of providing opportunities for development for our children. That no moment is too small to be able to provide that growth, to be able to provide that connection, to be able to provide reciprocity, and to be able to include one another. And Fred Rogers reminds us that these things don't happen by accident and that there are absolutely no shortcuts, but that it's worth the effort because it's through relationships that we all grow best and learn best. So the second lesson that we've learned across countless developmental settings is that human relationships are really important, but the power of those relationships come from interactions, small, simple, ordinary interactions that help to become the building blocks for those relationships to help us to learn and grow together. Now, this is about the time where we all start thinking about our own interactions that we have and thinking, oh no, every moment is important. I have to make sure I'm intentional about every single moment and it must be perfect. Which is why I think lesson 3, if I can pick a favorite lesson, this might be it. And that lesson is everything does not have to be perfect to be helpful. And this is a lesson that I've thought of before, that I'll share a Fred Rogers quote with you that originally put this thought into my head. And that quote has been a part of my life for quite some time. However, I don't know that I saw the power of this message until we were forced to come face to face with the last 8 months, where I don't know that we can say anything is perfect right now. In March, when the world came to a bit of a halt for us, I personally became a work from home researcher and work from home professor, and also a work from home 4th grade and kindergarten teacher, as my children were now learning at home. And I got to tell you, there weren't many moments that I would look at and say, oh, wow, that was perfect. There were a lot of imperfect times. But what we learned was that it doesn't have to be perfect in order to be effective and to be helpful. And that so much has changed. But there's so much that remains the same. So when Fred would be asked later in his career, how can you say that what you told us in the 60s and 70s is still relevant? Why would we think that that still matters? And Fred would tell them, well, while the outsides of childhood have certainly changed, the inner needs of children have remained the same. And I think that that's true for right now also, that the outsides of how we are approaching children and families, that has certainly changed. That we do this through screens, we do this through text messages now. We have used multiple different modes and mediums to engage with children and families. And while those may feel unnatural to us, and maybe those feel very imperfect, they still give us a chance to meet the inner needs of children and families, which remain the same. And our knowledge of what it means to reach children and families' inner needs, that remains the same too. That we can rely on everything that we know to be able to translate it into whatever the mode or medium happens to be that we're faced with because of these limitations and restrictions. I've had a number of people call me and ask me, Fred Rogers was the ultimate virtual teacher. He taught online or through a screen for 30 years. I said, yes, he did. And he did a lot of good through the screen. But it was the work off the screen that made that possible. It was his deep knowledge of child development and what children needed that he was able to take and bring on screen that was so very important. And that's a knowledge that we can't take away from our helpers, that they've all got it inside of them. We just need to stop looking at all the doors that are closed for long enough to see the opportunities that are still there. That right now we're faced with a lot of temporarily closed doors. But I'm reminded of that metaphor of when one door closes, another opens, and it's been attributed to a number of religious traditions, but it's also something that I found recently while reading a memoir of Helen Keller, where Helen Keller said that when one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened for us. That right now we're dealing with a lot of closed doors and a lot of imperfections. Nothing about these conditions are perfect. However, if we take the time to stop staring at everything we can't do and think about all the things we can do with the knowledge and skills that we have as helpers that we've honed through years of service to children and families and years of education in service of children and families, that we can take what we know works and find a way to make that work on the outsides as well. And the quote I was referring to earlier from Fred Rogers is one that is on my desk, both at home and in the office, as a reminder. And it was one that he talked about actually in relation to his own parenting, but I think that we can extend it to all helpers and educators and caregivers, which is that parents or educators can set the example by just being themselves rather than trying to be perfect. And that's something that isn't always easy to do. But Fred goes on to talk about his own parenting. And I find it deeply comforting that Mr. Rogers didn't think he was a good enough parent. Because if Mr. Rogers can own up to that, I think the rest of us can take a big collective deep breath. But he said that he realized everything does not have to be perfect in order to be effective. And I think that's a comfort to us right now, and that should provide hope to us right now also, because we can't control all of the imperfections surrounding us. But we can control what we're able to do to make sure our presence is still helpful and hopeful and as effective as we possibly can be with all of the limitations we've been handed. We can all do the best we can with what we have right now. So those are the 3 lessons that I wanted to share with you that we've learned across a number of settings well before our current situation, but still apply very much to now. That having at least one person, it really matters. That the power of relationships come from simple, ordinary moments, which are still very possible right now. And that interactions, and we as the people within them, they don't have to be perfect in order to be helpful or effective. That in every moment, our helpers are providing that hope, regardless of the imperfections or closed doors or circumstances surrounding us. But that we all can have and play a part in providing that hope for one another. And that isn't limited to just providing that hope for children and families, but providing that hope for our helpers as well. So Fred wasn't the most outspoken of men, although you knew what he believed deeply and to the core, and he did not waver from that. And one thing he talked about quite frequently was growing frustration around situations and people who were critical and thought that that was helpful. And he called them the helpful critics. But he also gave us another way to look at how we can help one another. And he called that helpful appreciation. And like to just give you a glimpse into what Fred thought it meant to be that helpful appreciator for children, for families, and for one another. That there must be times when you wonder what in the world you can do for a certain child or a certain family, yet you wanted so much to be of service that little by little the answer often comes to you. And you discover the way to be that helpful appreciator, which invariably makes the difference. No matter how primitive our resources may be, the greatest thing we can do is to find what is healthy and laudable about somebody else and reflect that to them. It is a large assignment to be able to help people look deep within themselves and find what is wonderful there, because at the core of everyone is someone wonderful. And I think that this idea of helpful appreciation goes a long way to serving children and families and one another by helping them to see what is still good, what is healthy and laudable about themselves, and to promote the type of kindness and compassion that Fred lived for his entire life, which was to acknowledge all of us as more than just one thing, to be able to look deep inside and see what is good, to reflect that to one another. And that becomes the foundation of what it means to build healthy communities, to engage families, and to help children to learn and to grow. Now we have a bit of a vision for how this really works in practice. And of course, it's based on relationships and based on finding space and touch points for interactions across an entire system that serves children and families. I'd like to share a little bit of that with you now. Of course, I don't think we would be, engaging in a call like this in a day of learning if we didn't care about the health and safety and well-being and thriving of our children as a part of our communities. And we know that that health and safety and well-being of children, that it begins in the home, and that we want to empower families to have strong relationships within the home, that family caregivers, these relationships become the foundation. But we also know that children are building relationships with helpers outside of the home. And that list there is endless. Educators, counselors, early intervention staff, human support services, they all are providing these relationships outside of the home for children too. And we want the big heads in this picture to have similar opportunities to connect and similar opportunities to build relationships and partnerships. That a transactional partnership between helpers outside of the home and family caregivers inside of the home won't be enough to truly support this system. That we need real partnership, real relationships that are built on some of the characteristics that we talked about earlier. Those simple, ordinary interactions that embrace the power of connection and inclusion, opportunities to grow and reciprocity. That these are possible between the adults in the lives of children as well. But even this gets challenging to continue to maintain without communities of support for families, someone for families to rely on, to come in and support the relationship building in the lives of children, but also that same community of support for our helpers. That we must be able to have relationships and interactions that promote the continued learning and growing of our helpers too. And we can't discount the importance of a child's community of peers as they grow. But if we are thinking about what relationships and interactions look like at every one of these touch points, then we're doing everything we can to promote the at least one, to promote that buffer, to be able to provide relationships that help children and families to bend with the wind but not break. And we all have our own responsibilities within this system. Maybe when you look here, you see yourself as both a blue head and an orange head, and sometimes a child as well. And that's okay. That we will shift into different roles as our time grows in serving children and families. And while this might look a bit imposing, that, oh my goodness, there's so much, there's so many touch points, that we all have our own little part to play within this. And I'm sure you know the story of the metaphor of the puddle with the raindrops, that each drop created its own ripple until the puddle was indiscernible between where a drop had fallen and where it had not. And that's the same for our system building as well, that we can engage families and build communities by each of us doing our part within these touch points to be sure that those within the system have high quality interactions and relationships that help them to learn and to grow and to support one another. And how do we do this at every level of a system? Well, it's by making sure that we keep these relationships as primary, that they become the foundation for everything else that we do. That anytime we are making a decision, that we're asking ourselves this question, that how does anything that we're doing, whether that be a practice, a program, a policy, how does it help to encourage, enrich, and empower human interactions around children and their helpers? Because if we're making decisions that do the opposite, then we are not helping our children and families to grow and to learn and to become stronger. But if decisions that we're making are discouraging, disempowering relationships, then we have no chance of getting that at least one through the door. That we have no chance of leveraging the importance of interactions to build relationships because the conditions around it won't support it. That we all have to be doing everything we can in good times and in bad to make sure that we're encouraging, enriching, and empowering relationships at every level of a child and youth serving system. Now, that picture that I just showed you is a theory of change maybe, or an illustration of what it looks like when the system is all working together. But right now, it might seem like that system is a bit disrupted because of the limitations and restrictions placed upon us, that right now, it might feel a little bit more like this, that physical distancing and restrictions around us have disrupted what it means to build these connections, that we've got children spending a lot more time in the home with families, and we've got helpers on the outside trying to figure out the best way possible to rebuild what we know works. And when we've talked with a lot of folks that we've worked with throughout the years, and we've talked with them about how the current conditions have affected them, the number one thing we hear from helpers is that they feel so isolated, that they want to help. They've lived a life of helping, and they can't figure out how to do it now. And that they feel a lack of support from one another because there is no research-based guide that's going to help us through this. And there's no guide for how to educate children and reach families during a global pandemic. That one hasn't been written yet. My hope is that if it does get written, it's not used again. But right now, our helpers are going to get us through this by trial and error and by testing things out. But they can't do it alone. That the number one step to rebuilding our system right now is to provide the support to our helpers, to rebuild whatever a community of support may look like for them, whatever that shape that might take, to allow them to try things and share that challenge and share the successes and advocate for one another, that we have to rebuild the support around our helpers. Because then that gives us an opportunity to begin to rebuild and sustain those relationships with families. That as our helpers feel less and less isolated and more supported to continue to help, that will just bleed right into our relationships that we have with families, which gives us then that method back to our children. That if our helpers continue to support our families, that they can continue to have these high quality interactions and build relationships with children. And it gives us a chance to rebuild that community of support around families as well. Because right now our families and our helpers are cut off essentially from what has become their support. That we see families who cannot be in touch with extended families at this time and have lost a lot of that support. That we must do everything we can to rebuild that in hopes that then our helpers can re-engage directly with children too, in ways that continue to help their learning and growing. But that this connection becomes important because it allows us to build the resilience of our helpers and our families. And the reason that I started this picture with our helpers in rebuilding is because I'm a firm believer that we cannot make a lasting impact on children if we're going to skip over the needs of the adults. That the adults must be well in order to do the work of serving children and families. That we must help our helpers in that work as much as we hope to help our children and our families in that work. And what does that mean, to help our helpers? I think it means doing for our helpers what the best helpers are doing for children and for families. So maybe that means providing them with that same space to learn and grow, reestablishing and rebuilding and maintaining connections and support to allow our helpers to try things out, to test them, to make mistakes, and to come back stronger. That's the same environment that we want for children, but it doesn't stop when we're children. That as grown-ups, we need that same connection. We need that same opportunity to grow. We need reciprocity, and we have to have inclusion to make sure that we are all having the best chance possible to rebuild and strengthen the support for one another, to be there for one another in ways that allow us to be helpful appreciators of what it is that we're doing, but also allows us to continue the work of helping. That as we test out whatever's going to work to get us through these temporary circumstances, that we have one another to do that, and that we can build that community of support. Because that connection is what it means to be resilient. That we have to have human connection as the foundation of rebuilding the connections that we have within our communities and our families. And that these ordinary moments, though they seem very, very different on the outside, are still absolutely possible. That even though the mode of what we're doing has changed, that we can still ask this question of what we're doing. That how do the decisions that we're making continue to encourage, enrich, and empower human connections and support around children and their helpers? Now, this might be at times a very difficult question to answer, especially now, as everything seems so uncertain. But it is absolutely possible to think about how we are intentional in the moments that we have to reach out to one another, to share support and connection, and then to reach out to families as well with that same support and connection. Now, I'd like to wrap up my speaking part before we open up to see if there are any questions from anyone with a message from Fred Rogers. So you can't have a speaker from the Fred Rogers Center and not expect to hear Fred Rogers at least once. So this is your at least one Fred Rogers moment of the day. Fred did not talk directly to adults all that often. However, he did, in times of challenge and uncertainty, he would come and do public service addresses for adults to help them help children. Now, my guess is that right now his phone would be incredibly busy, because I know how busy our phone has been with people calling and saying, "Can you tell us what Fred would do right now?" Which is a question that I decline to answer every time I'm asked. I don't know what Fred would do right now. However, I do know that we can learn a lot from what Fred did in times past to put into action now. And so I wanted to share with you a message from one of those times past when our country was going through a great deal of uncertainty and challenge. So Fred did public service addresses. His first one was when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. He came out and did a Mr. Rogers Neighborhood for Adults, where he talked about what assassination meant. And Daniel Tiger asked Lady Aberlin, "What does assassination mean?" And Fred gave us the words to talk to our children about what was happening. And he also did the same thing when the Challenger exploded, when the Gulf War started. And this particular message is one of the many messages around September 11th. So he came out of retirement September 11th to talk with families about how to help children. And then this message was on the 1-year anniversary of September 11th, where he came back to thank families and helpers for the space that they've provided for children during these difficult times. So this would have been September 11th of 2002, and Fred passed away in February of 2003. So this was one of the last times that Fred was in public. And it's a message that I want to provide for you today because I see it as a message of hope. I see it as a message to thank our helpers for that hope they provide. And I hope that this message is one that encourages you as you face whatever's coming next, as you continue to rebuild and reemerge just stronger than you even were before. So here's just a closing message from Fred.
You know, it happens so often. I walk down the street and someone 20 or 30 or 40 years old will come up to me and say, "You are Mr. Rogers, aren't you?" And then they tell me about growing up with the neighborhood and how they're passing on to the children they know what they found to be important in our television work. Like expressing their feelings through music and art and dance and sports and drama and computers and writing, and invariably we end our little time together with a hug. I'm just so proud of all of you who have grown up with us, and I know how tough it is some days to look with hope and confidence on the months and years ahead. But I would like to tell you what I often told you when you were much younger. I like you just the way you are. And what's more, I'm so grateful to you for helping the children in your life to know that you'll do everything you can to keep them safe and to help them express their feelings in ways that will bring healing in many different neighborhoods. It's such a good feeling to know that we're lifelong friends.
I'd like to extend my thanks to you as well for the hard work you're doing right now, for the many, many decisions that have been incredibly difficult to make, and for your continued service to children and families in times when it seems like there is no hope. You provide that hope, and I do hope that as you continue to be helpers in your own neighborhoods, that you see the power that you have in just ordinary moments to be exactly what children and families need, especially now. So thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winters. We appreciate your message today. We wanted to make a note that today is National Good Neighbor Day, so it's a perfect day for you to be representing the Fred Rogers Institute. So we're so glad to have you here. We have some time for questions. Does anyone have questions? If you'd like to enter those into the chat box. I believe we also may have the opportunity to unmute. I don't know if people are able to unmute themselves. There's 158 people on this call, so the chat or trying to unmute might be a best option. Yes, we have a question. See if I can unmute you. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question. The mute button is down in the lower left part of your screen if you haven't found that yet. I realize it takes a minute for people to type too.
Catherine, I have a question for Dr. Winters.
Great.
Dr. Winters, we are going to be talking later today around the topic of racial equity. So my question is, what did Mr. Rogers talk about in regards to his concerns, his suggestions on really helping us as a predominantly white culture close the gaps around racial equity, in particular with relationships, how to build relationships with our communities of color?
Sure. So it's one topic that Fred never directly talked about, although our work at the center, we've built a bit on the philosophy that he had within Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and also in some of his talks, that we hear a lot about the importance of kindness. And we've also heard some backlash on the importance of kindness. And that's because I think kindness in our society today is reduced to being nice to one another. And that's not the kindness that Fred had in mind. Sure, it's good to be nice to one another. But for Fred, kindness meant approaching our neighbors from a place of compassion and empathy. But that meant to see beyond who they maybe happen to be on the outside. And he called that acknowledging everyone for being more than just one thing. And that's what he did anytime that he highlighted the importance of celebrating one another in your differences and in the ways that you're alike. But for him, kindness really was built on the foundation of seeing more than just one thing in every person. And that means acknowledging their difference, acknowledging their journey, acknowledging who they are, to be able to build those relationships with them in genuine ways that appreciate who they are. And I think when we think of racial equity, we're faced with especially in predominantly white communities, it's something that we've been talking a lot about because in Pennsylvania, we have very similar demographics, I think, to Wisconsin, actually, where we have a lot of communities where difference is just not something that they think about because they're never faced with it. And how do we support conversations around that? How do we support not ignoring that it's possible to have these conversations? And that starts with acknowledging that we are all more than just one thing, and that we must get to the core of what that means for each other in our differences. That kindness is not just being nice to everyone in the same way, but kindness is appreciating each one of us and being kind and being compassionate and being empathic to one another for those differences as well.
Wonderful. I'm seeing some thank yous coming through on the chat as well. Any other questions for Dr. Winters? This is going to be a perfect segue into what we're going to be discussing for the rest of this morning. So we really appreciate the messages that you're giving us today.
Great.
Dr. Winters,
Yes.
I got to see you on the PBS special, if we can speak today, on talking to your kids about race. And one of the things that you had mentioned there is at home, your kids were like, what's racism? And you teach about it and all of this. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you did that with your own kids?
Sure. So these are conversations that we've been having in our family. And then I realized that I'd never named it. I'd never used the term. I think that particular conversation was as I was doing the PBS Kids work. I was talking with my 10-year-old about what I was doing. And she goes, well, Mom, what is racism? And I realized that even though we'd had conversations about race, we'd never named it and we never talked about it. And so I made it a point to make sure we use the terms that we hear all the time, which is racism and segregation, and in terms that sometimes as a white mom, I never thought I could perfectly define, but I was reminded about doesn't have to be perfect to be effective. and that these conversations, that even though they might be imperfect, showing our children that it's okay to struggle with them, and showing our children that that struggle is worth it and we must have them, I think is incredibly important. And I want to acknowledge my privilege as a white mom to be able to decide when I have those conversations, because my brother-in-law, as a Black man, has never been able to decide when he has a conversation about race, that has been a part of his life for his entire life. And I think that I want to make sure that those conversations, even though they might seem uncomfortable, that we're helping families to have the beginning words of them. There will be a special on PBS Kids coming up that talks about that as well. I believe it's, I should know this as an advisor, I think it's October 9th that they're doing this special, where they're helping parents to find those first words of conversation and to be able to find more comfort with it. Because it's absolutely something that we have to do, and we have to support one another in those conversations as well.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll look forward to finding that in our listings. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Winters.